Good evening, and welcome to the History and Genealogy Virtual Classroom. Today is March 15th, 2021, and the time is 6:35. Thank you for joining us. My name is Robin McDonough, and I will be moderating this Zoom session. Today's class, Before 1850 Early American Research, will be taught by Jacob Eubanks. This class will be recorded and made available on the St. Louis County website and on the library's YouTube channel. Please ask questions by clicking on the Q&A icon and typing your question or comment. The chat has been disabled for this webinar. Anything you type in the chat will not be seen. The instructor will answer questions at the end of this session. You will, however, find a link to the handout in the chat. Closed captioning is available by clicking on the closed captioning icon on your Zoom screen. You can also turn that closed captioning off. I will now turn this over to Jake, and we will begin the class.
All right, thank you, Robin. As she said, my name's Jacob Eubanks. I'm the Assistant Manager of History and Genealogy here at St. Louis County Library. And this evening's program is Before 1850 Early American Research. To tell you just a little bit about myself, I'm originally from Topeka, Kansas. My ancestors settled Kansas as early as 1857, and they were major migrants, jumping generation to generation, never staying anywhere for a very long time. They came from Pennsylvania and Virginia and Maryland and North Carolina, and they ended up in Kentucky and Indiana and Ohio, and eventually Iowa and Missouri and Arkansas, finally reaching Kansas at some point. And so when I do genealogy research for my own family, I've had to spend a lot of time trying to chase down people who didn't stay anywhere for a very long time. A lot of researchers find that they spend a lot of time working in a location. They may become extremely familiar with the records, like here in St. Louis. But with my family, I don't have that luxury. And so I had to develop many different techniques and strategies, or at least identify techniques and strategies for finding these individuals. And so that's where the basis for today's talk comes from. It's these different strategies and techniques that I've had to employ over that time. Now I'm going to go ahead and close my video here so that we can just go into the PowerPoint and move forward. Give me a moment to do that. All right, let's get going. Before we begin, I just want to let you know that St. Louis County Library has a ton of classes that have been recorded and are available on our website. As you're beginning to do genealogy, there's a lot of good introductory material on the census. I love the beginning genealogy research class. It's one of my favorites to teach, but it's a great resource. And what we're going to be talking about today is basically taking what's learned in that beginning genealogy class and taking the next step. We go over the different types of records that are available in that class. Here we're going to talk about the different processes, techniques that we can employ, and things we can find within the records that we wouldn't necessarily have been going to look at those records as we were pursuing them for. Now, why 1850? Well, the U.S. federal census has been done every 10 years from 1790 to today, and it's available through 1940 via Ancestry or Heritage Quest, any of the databases where the census has been digitized and made available, minus the 1890 census, which was damaged or destroyed depending on which states you're talking about. The census is a genealogical roadmap for us. It's a great place for us to go and dig in. But the census has changed over time, and those early census records are very limited in what they provide. From 1790 to 1840, the only people recorded by name are heads of household. And so that means there are no married women, there are no children, and there are going to be no slaves who are going to be recorded as well. So it's a limited amount of information that can be extracted here. You get the name of the head of household and the individuals living within that household. They're just marked down as numbers. If you see women in the census during this time frame, they're probably either a divorcee, a widow, or they're an unmarried woman who has, advanced beyond age 21. So that's very limited in who you can find in the census during this time period. The census also creates major problems for us because there's no children recorded during that time frame. It creates these proximity gaps. This is my example that I use all the time for talks. It's my great-great-grandfather, Henry S. Crumrine, who happens to be the first family member who settled in Kansas. He made it there in 1857. Now, he was born in 1824, and he never appears by name in proximity of his parents. His parents actually died around 1831. And so there's no way to connect him through census records with them. These proximity gaps, there's a lot of them. You know, if an individual was born in 1823, they were 17 in 1840 and 27 by 1850. So the first time they could potentially show up nearby their parents in 1850, that's a huge time frame to have to deal with. Individuals born in 1817, you know, they're 14 in 1830, they're 25 in 1840. By the time, you know, we get to 1850, it's just not possible to put these people together. And so we have to keep that in mind as we're doing our census research, that we're going to have to deal with these people who are born in a time period when they're likely not to appear with their family members at any time on the census records. The census is also limited because of this practice known as COVERTURE, or the ladies' law. Married women have limited rights. Under COVERTURE, a married woman was considered covered by her husband in the eyes of the law. In the US, we followed the English common law. And in the English common law, what would happen when you got married, your husband basically was considered the individual who the court would deal with on everything. And so married women had no right to property. They have no right to probates. They have no right to be a proprietor of a business. By comparison, single women, femme sole, if they were never married, you know, if they were a widow, if they were a divorcee, they had a right to all of these things. And so we'll find wills for divorcees or widows, but we won't find wills for married women. Similarly, married women couldn't serve as like administrators to probates. So if her father died and she was the only heir, she couldn't be the administrator if she was married. Now, that said, if her husband died, she could be the administrator and often was the administrator to his probate. But that creates a problem in trying to find daughters and connecting them with their fathers. There's no real place where they could participate in the records of their father. There's a lot of great resources if you're interested in learning more about women and women's rights. COVERTURE, The Laws of Property, Women in the Law of Property in Early America by Marilyn Salmon. It's in your further reading list. I can't recommend that book enough. It's fantastic. It's a great resource. I covered deed records in our Passports newsletter back in September of 2019, and it looks at what can be extracted evidence-wise about women from the deed records. Deeds, the land, as things were transferred from one person to another under COVERTURE, the woman had to sign off on the transfers of her husband. So there's a deed acknowledgement or a release, and her name should appear in that. Oftentimes, that's the only place I find her name, unless there's a marriage record or she's buried next to her husband. That deed acknowledgement is one of the best records you can find. As we're talking about pre-1850 research, we also have to keep in mind that, you know, record keeping just wasn't that important. As we move further and further forward in time, there's a lot of record loss, courthouse fires, there's a lack of record keeping. Marriages are the first vital records that are kept. And the reason they're the first vital records and why anybody cared to keep them was this practice of COVERTURE. We had to prove who owned what and who was an heir to what, who received what. And so we needed that legal record there. You know, we don't see civil records in most counties and states until 1900, 1910 time period when it starts becoming common practice. Some counties may have kept death registers or birth registers, but it wasn't consistent. And it differed, the practices, it's just different from one place to another. And that applies, that applies to every type of record. You'll see different types of courts for keeping probates, orphans courts, chancery courts, common pleas, civil, district, county. It differs from state to state. And so we have to keep that in mind as we're looking that, what we find in Ohio in this place is probably not going to be in the same place in Pennsylvania, and how they kept it in Pennsylvania will be different than they kept it in Indiana, but there'll be similarities too. As we talk about that, a book that is constantly on my desk is the Red Book of American State, County, and Town Sources by Alice Eichholz. If you're not familiar with this book, you need to become familiar with it. It literally lives on the corner of my desk. This book is amazing. Eichholz has gone through every state and identified every county, provided us with dates of formation, counties that they were formed out of, and usually provides us with dates of civil records, of vital records, and of court records, excuse me. So birth, marriage, and death, it tells us when their records begin, land, probate, and court. Here we have an example there. Here's Kosciuszko County in Indiana. I do a lot of research, have done a lot of research there, so that's why it's my example. Date formed 1835. It was an unorganized area, Cass, Elkhart, and Grant counties. We have birth registers beginning in 1882, marriages beginning in 1830. See, they start much earlier than the birth or death. 1882 for the death. We have land records dating to 1834, as well as probate and court records going back to 1836. In addition to those lists, this book provides us with a breakdown by state of the types of records that are available, and what kind of records fall into that and how they're organized. Maybe it talks about the indexing that's available. Now the book's a little dated, but the indexing still applies, and we have a lot of those indexes here at History and Genealogy in print. Maybe you'll find them at your local library. Some of them have been digitized by Family Search, depending on what state and the type of records. Here we have an example. Land records, Indiana. Indiana is a public domain state or a federal land state. That means that title was issued by the federal government. And so that tells me that it'll be on a grid. Here we have another example, Kentucky. By comparison, Kentucky is a state land state. Its land was issued via survey. So what happened here? Federal government would go in to these new territories, and they would use a township and range survey ahead of time and survey the property and then sell it off. In Kentucky, an individual was issued a warrant. They would go out, warrant for survey, they would go out, they would survey their property, and then they would return their survey to the land office, who would then issue a deed based off of that survey. So we have two completely different practices right here for land records. If you're doing land research, and if you're doing pre-1850 research, you just about have to do land research. There are two wonderful books, Land and Property Research in the United States by E. Wade Hone, and Locating Your Roots, Discovering Your Ancestors Using Land Records by Patricia Law Hatcher. Both of these books are fantastic. We have circulating copies. We are home to the National Genealogical Society's book loan collection, so you can get a copy of either one of these from us via interlibrary loan if you don't have it at your local library. Now let's look at look a little bit more at the Red Book. Here's an example. This is probate records in Pennsylvania. As I said, you just don't know where these records could be pulled from. Here we have all these different types of records in Pennsylvania and different courts that are covering it. All of this is outlined in this book. Here in Pennsylvania, they don't have a probate court. In Pennsylvania, they had a county register of wills, and then they have an orphans court. And the orphans court clerk ends up being the county register of wills. They, in many cases, especially in Berks and Bucks, In Lancaster County, some of the early counties, they often have original records such as wills, bonds, and account books. Most of the time, what you're going to find in probate records are going to be clerk's copies. They're going to be copies of the original will, not the original will itself. Other things you see here, we have letters of administration, docket books, guardianships. This is just scratching the surface of what's available out there. There are so many different types of records of probate. You just can't believe it, how much is out there. You will find similar resources like this regarding civil records, court records, church records, land records in the Red Book. You gotta take a look at this thing. You always need to have it handy when you're doing pre-1850 research. If you can get your own personal copy, I even recommend that. It's an indispensable resource. If you're not willing to do that, similar resource, not as well put together, but you can get to a lot of the information, is the Family Search Research Wiki. That's out there for you. You can go in and search and find these different types of information there as well. I just don't think it's as comprehensive as the Red Book is. But I do use it on occasion too, or if I find something in the Red Book and I want to get a second opinion, I'll consult the Family Search Wiki as well. Another resource I highly recommend is the Research Guide to American Genealogy by Val D. Greenwood. This is another one that sits on my desk quite often, particularly when I'm doing probate research. She provides wonderful breakdowns of the different types of probate records, some of which I don't even know. And so I need to look at it occasionally to find out what the heck they're talking about. So let's begin taking a look at some strategies or some techniques and how I employ techniques in genealogical research before 1850. The first thing I want to talk about is something called reasonably exhaustive research. And if you've ever taken a genealogy class, you've probably heard the term before. Maybe it hasn't been outlined for you to the level I'm going to here, but you've probably got an idea of what this is about. Reasonably exhaustive research is not digging through everything possible. You know, you're not looking at every record. You probably are going to look at every record, but I don't want you to think like you're going to have to dig through everything that is possibly out there under the sun to find what you're looking for. Reasonably exhaustive research is all about evidence. It's about finding evidence. That evidence is necessary to answer questions about identity, relationships, or situations or events. Evidence isn't records, and this is where I want, right off the start, we need to separate those two out. Records, that's the will. Record is the birth record. It's the burial record. Evidence is things that you can extract from that. And sometimes it's a matter of, you know, this baptismal register, it says that they came from here. That little bit of information may not have gone to the baptismal register for it, but that little bit of information is the evidence that you're looking for to go to the next place. You're looking for sufficient data. You're not looking for all data. Reasonably exhaustive research, you're looking for anything relevant to your question. You're not necessarily looking for everything that's out there. The common record that every person comes to history and genealogy and asks about is the passenger list. And the first question out of every single expert here out of their mouth is, why are you looking for the passenger list? There are good reasons to look for the passenger list, and there are less good reasons. Well, I want to know what boat they came over on. Okay, that's fine. That's a reasonable request. I want to know what village they came from in Germany or England or wherever is not a reasonable request because passenger list doesn't say that. If you want to know who they came over on the boat with, that's an excellent reason to look for that record. So relevancy is important when we're doing this. You don't need to look for everything. You don't need the passenger list if you already know the village of origin. It's not important to what you're doing. Reasonably exhaustive research is actually more of a process. And I want you to apply this process as we talk about the rest of the strategies today, because it's going to come into play as I do every single thing going forward. You're seeking evidence. You're going to process your findings. You're going to interpret every source or document that you look at, not as the document itself, but for the evidence that's contained within it. What can you work out from this? You're going to correlate all of your details and evaluate the evidence as it's presented, and then you'll develop new queries. And it's just going to be cyclical. You're going to keep doing that as you're looking at different things. And those things may just be a history of the town. They may not be a record at all. So just think about that process as we move forward. Speaking of evidence, step 2, or technique 2, embracing evidence-based research. One of my favorite genealogy quotes that I've ever found is from Elizabeth Shown Mills from a talk she gave in 2017 at the National Genealogical Society Conference in Virginia. She said that insight is generated by reconstructing an entire life, studying a person in the context of family, neighborhood, and social environment, linking people through chains of evidence that demonstrate ongoing interactions, proximity, and common patterns. What is evidence? We've hit on it, so much already. What is evidence? Webster's defines it as a body of facts or information indicating whether a belief or proposition is true or valid. Now, keep terms there: belief or proposition. Evidence is not absolute. There are 3 types of evidence. The first type is direct evidence, where the evidence directly answers a research question. A birth certificate is direct evidence of an individual's birth. There is indirect evidence, in which you take 2 pieces of evidence and you arrange them in a way that is an argument for proof. You could take this birth certificate and you can take this death record and determine that somebody lived between those 2 documents. Now, you wouldn't do that in your research, but it's a perfect example of what we're talking about when we're talking about indirect evidence. When you get into 1820, 1810, and you don't have those kind of records, you start assembling records to do this. I have an example of a McGinley who purchases land in what is today Pennsylvania in 1745. The earliest evidence that I have of him in the U.S. is in 1824. He is a witness to a will in Baltimore County, Maryland. And he dies in 1869. I can assemble, therefore, from that information that he was in the continental U.S. and the colonial United States from 1824 to, or not 1724 to 1769. And that means that he came over more than likely based off of the date of death or the age of death on his headstone sometime between 1700 and 1724. That's indirect evidence. It's not guaranteed that we're going to be right about when he came over, but I can get an approximate time frame. The third type of evidence, and the most common type I deal with, is negative evidence. And as you're doing research prior to 1850, you're going to spend a lot of time developing proofs based off of negative evidence. Negative evidence is an inference which can be drawn from absences of a situation. If 8 children are born in a place, 7 of them have marriages and the 8th doesn't, where's the 8th child's marriage? Did that child die? More than likely. Did that child get married somewhere else? Probably not. The inference is that child probably died before they were old enough to get married. The great example I have here is that when the clock tower rings every hour and the dog barks every hour, and then the clock tower rings and the dog doesn't bark, we know that the dog isn't outside where it can hear the clock tower. That is negative evidence. Let's take a look at an example of evidence. Federal land records, I mentioned them before. These are land records where the federal government went out, they surveyed the land using township, section, and range, and then the land was sold by military bounty and land patents. Now, these records are available on BLM GLO Records website. We have a great database called historygeo.com, and I'm going to show you several images during today's talk, which are drawn from History Geo. I've got a wonderful tutorial up on our website in our tutorials called Resources for Mapping First Land Title in Public Land States. This is going to cover Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Missouri, Kansas, any of the federal land states. On GLO records, there are land patents and bounty warrants up, digitized, all of them are up there. And you can find great evidence in these records. Here we have one individual. He settled in Wabash County, Indiana. He got a bounty warrant and he got a land patent for two separate pieces of property. What's cool about these records is they have evidence that isn't tied to the land. Here we see the patent, and on the land patent, it tells me where to look for him prior to this patent being issued in 1850. It says Henry S. Crumrine of Clark County, Ohio. If I were to go check the census and start looking for him on the census, in 1850, I can actually find him living in Clark County, Ohio. Now, his bounty warrant, it gives me his service information. He served in Captain Bradley's company, 1st Regiment, Ohio Volunteers. Why would you go to a land record to look for this? This is evidence that you wouldn't think of necessarily unless you were indoctrinated in researching in these records. But here I could go find his enlistment records in Captain Bradley's company. I can trace the history of Captain Bradley's company. I would find out that they enlisted in Cincinnati, Ohio. They eventually ended up going down to Mexico. And in fact, this individual served alongside several famous individuals, including Ulysses S. Grant. Now, our next strategy that we're going to talk about is cluster research. And I'm going to go back to Elizabeth Shown Mills for a second in that great quote. She hits on cluster research within it. Family, neighborhood, and social environment. And she talks about interactions, proximities, and common patterns. That, in a nutshell, is what cluster research is. It's looking at family, neighborhood, and social environment, and any interactions, proximities, or patterns that might exist for an individual. Now, Mills oftentimes refers to this as the fan club or family, associates, and neighbors. Who might be in the fan club? Obviously the family, but there are a lot of other people. And these are people that a lot of times I think researchers don't think to look at. Number one on the list, for me, I always stress it, it's clergy. You gotta research clergy. Of all the people who are recorded in local communities prior to 1850, the number one person is always going to be the minister. They have bios in the history books. There are whole histories written about denominations. Local churches often have their own histories that are recorded. You've got to research the clergy. You also need to look at the congregants of the church. People become friends with their community, and their community is generally the people who are attending the same church as them, and you usually go to the church that's closest to you, which means we got to also look at all the neighbors. On top of that, we need to be looking for their in-laws. We need to look for fraternal members of organizations. If they served in the Civil War, who are the Civil War soldiers that live in their area? Are they members of the Grand Army of the Republic or the Confederate Sons? Are they ex-military? Are they political allies? Do they serve in different roles in the community? Are they, on the school board? Are they land surveyors? Who are the local store owners? Those are people that they would dealt with on a daily basis. Do they have business partners who they're engaged with? Are they running a newspaper? Are they running a general store? Who are they working with? We have to research all of these people. We cannot just focus on the individual because there aren't enough records. Places we can look for this information and identify these people include land records, census records, tax lists, voter registrations, city and county directories, local histories, newspapers, probate records. I could go on, but these are the ones that I spend the most time trying to track these people down. I want to show you an example. This map is pulled from History Geo. These are land patents and bounty warrants. Here is William McGinley in 1837, living in Kosciuszko County, Indiana, which we've talked about previously. Just on this screen alone, these are all of the individuals who purchased land in 1837 from the federal government, the same year as William McGinley. That's a lot of names. And I would want to take a look at every single one of these names, because who knows when the connection is going to hit. For example, these four individuals, these Boydstons, I didn't know it at the time when I looked at this, but Thomas G. Boydston is William McGinley's brother-in-law, and George Boydston is William McGinley's father-in-law. By tracing the Boydston family and where they came from prior to this point, I was able to find the marriage of William McGinley to his wife, Eunice Boydston. All I did was look at this list and I started tracing the people, and I was able to locate them. In Wayne County, Ohio, I found their marriage. I posted this particular case one time on LinkedIn. And a gentleman that I worked with, he was at the county archives, or county museum, excuse me, and I was at the county library in Johnson County, Kansas. He saw it and he contacted me and said, you know, I had some McClearys that were in that county. And there they are, living right nearby one another. They came to Kansas at the same time. They ended up living in Jefferson and Johnson counties. But when I researched the McClearys further, because he hadn't gotten past this point, when I researched them further, I found the McGinleys and the McClearys in Adams County, Pennsylvania, buried in the same cemetery. People move in groups. And so as we're doing our research before 1850, we always have to keep that in mind, that the people are going to be traveling with their fan club, with their cluster. And so if we can find those people, we can bind them to them and find them using those other individuals. Here's another example of cluster research. This is Valentine Smith. Valentine is buried in Wayne County, Ohio. This is an estate case file for his estate. And if we look at all the people who were paid out of his estate, we could identify people in his cluster. We could identify his son-in-law, his brother-in-law from those records. So we need to pay attention to any time we see a list like that, including the census. Here we see William McGinley on the census in 1840. We don't know if this individual is his cousin. We don't know if this individual is his brother-in-law or his best friend. We need to try to figure out where these people came from. And sometimes you may need to do 2 or 3 pages of the census while you're doing your research. I know it sounds extraneous, but sometimes you have to do it. Look at names that appear over and over again. Maybe they appear on the will, or maybe they appear in the probate. They've received something from the estate, or maybe they're serving as the executor of the estate, and look at them in the census and trace them in the census back. You need to pay attention to all the people, not just the individual you're working on. Do not just get focused on that one person or that one little family. You need to focus beyond that. Speaking of the clergy, and one of my examples here is following the minister. I can't stress this one enough. The minister is always written about in local histories. And so we can take them a lot of times and figure things out. Now you can usually identify a minister if you've got a marriage register or a church marriage. Maybe you just look at the proximity of your ancestor to a particular congregation. Maybe they appear in the early congregants list of that congregation. There's a lot of different places where you might figure it out. In this particular example, we find Henry Crumrine and Sarah Main getting married in Perry County, Ohio in 1822, and the minister for all 3 marriages listed right here for this Overmeyer and this other one below it, which we can't quite see there, is Andrew Hinkle, ML, minister Lutheran. If I research Lutherans in Perry County, Ohio, I find out that Andrew Hinkle was the minister at St. Paul's Lutheran Church, or Smith's Church, which was in Somerset, Ohio. Interestingly enough, this is the first, this is where the Ohio Synod is formed, was in 1817 at St. Paul's Lutheran Church in Somerset. Andrew Hinkle was the presiding minister of the formation of the Ohio Synod. And we can look at this history of Perry County, Ohio, and here we see all these early congregants and all these names: Swinehart, Ridenour, Zartman, Besor. We get a lot of good surnames here, unique surnames. And if we did a little bit more research, and we found using Percy database. If you're not familiar with Percy, Percy is the periodical source index. It's a database that's been produced by the Allen County Library in Allen County, Indiana. They have gone through for many decades now, gone through periodicals and done subject and first 5 names indexing, and they've created this database. It's on Find My Past. I mentioned it in your handout, so you can refer back to that. You don't have to have a Find My Past account to access it. It's free. You can just go on Find My Past, the periodical source index, and search it. And I searched in it here for Lutherans in Perry County, and found an article on Lutheranism in Perry County, Ohio in, in Ohio Archaeological and Historical Publications. And sure enough, it lists early congregants. There's that Ridenour, Zartman, Swinehart, there they all are again. We get Binkley and Poorman, and we add that to our list. If we look at my ancestor, Christian Grumrind, and his property in 1810, and we take those names that we just pulled from those lists, there they all are. They were all members of the same church. And although my Christian Grumrind does not appear in the indexing that was of early congregants listed in these 2 articles, I can pretty much guarantee that he was attending the same church, because his son was married by the same minister that all of these people were attending the church with. So if I research these individuals going forward, looking, in Virginia or Pennsylvania or wherever, I'm probably going to be able to find my Crumrinds. I'll be able to trace them using that info. Outside of that, there are many different, denominational histories that exist out there. Here's an example, the Presbytery of Carlisle, and here's Amos Alexander McGinley. He is a collateral line of one of my McGinleys. It's his brother. And here he is. Here's his picture. We have a whole bio on him, and it talks about where he came from in Fairfield and Adams County, Pennsylvania, and talks about his family history. So if you have a clergy member in your family, definitely look for these, because they tell you everything. But you can use them as clues too, because people follow their minister. So if he goes from Adams to, I can't remember where he ended up, Franklin County, I think, Pennsylvania is where he is. You could probably follow other people who moved from Adams to Franklin with it. Yeah, here we go. History of Franklin County, Pennsylvania. Here it talks about it. Amos Alexander McGinley of Adams County. Now this is a small move. This is just moving from one county to another. But we'll see people moving across the country. One of my McGinley ancestors was a Methodist minister, and he's a Methodist minister in Indiana, and I find him as a Methodist minister in Douglas County, Kansas, and eventually in Crowley County, Kansas. And all the people that follow with him, I can trace. And so you want to be able to pay attention to the clergy and trace them, because they're a great resource. As we've been talking, local histories, they are overlooked. So often people forget that these are out there, or they don't think of what evidence might be contained within them. Local histories almost always have a list of early settlers. I can't stress that early settlers list enough. You've already seen how you can use it to locate people. Focus in on that. Look for those early settlers. Here we've got those more names that I can pull. Dean Hesler Wiseman. And if we look at that list, Christian Grumrind, there they are as well. They're not necessarily in the congregation, but they are in that early settlers list, all with similar dates of settlement to my Christian Grumrind. Here's another example. A lot of times these local histories have biographies in them. And you're not necessarily looking for the biography of the person you're working on. Look for their family. Look for mentions of their name. Sometimes there are indexes in these. Sometimes county historical societies or genealogical societies have gone on in and done every name indexes. You got to look in them because you don't know what you're going to find in these that you might not have found without those indexes or without looking for just the surname appearing. Here we have an example of a Benjamin Boydston, who I wasn't looking for. But in it, he gives my ancestors. He talks about his parents, George Boydston and Barbara Smith Boydston. And he talks about his siblings, which includes Eunice McGinley, the wife of Reverend McGinley, who we talked about previously. And there's Thomas, who we talked about previously, Thomas G. Boydston. They're all there in this biography in Kosciuszko County, Indiana, for Benjamin S. Boydston, not who I was looking for. Again, let's go to back to that Ohio Archaeological and Historical Publications. Here we can go into periodical source index as we talked about just moments ago and search. Oh, it didn't show it there, but here we're going to search for Perry, Indiana. We're searching for Lutherans and Lutherans in the county, Ohio Archaeological. You can also go in and search newspapers, connect with local history, look for things like obituaries, articles, biographies, marriages, social engagements, estate sales. There's so many different things out there in local newspapers that people don't think to look for. People would just show up at someone's home and it would make it in the newspaper. So-and-so came calling at George Smith's house this evening. So-and-so lives in wherever, and they married, and they're the daughter of whomever. You never know what's going to be recorded. Here's an example. My ancestor, Henry S. Crumrine, who we saw before, he lived in Douglas County, Kansas, but in neighboring DeSoto in Johnson County, Kansas, there was a biography after his death. I believe that it was a GAR memorial, Grand Army of the Republic. Anyone who served in the Union Army could be a member. And he certainly was a member of the Grand Army. There are plenty of bits of pieces of information out there where it says, that he was not only a member, but an active member and oftentimes an officer. And they published a biography on him in a newspaper in the neighboring county. And then it tells me where he was born. It tells me the date of his birth. It tells me who he married, where he married her. Interestingly enough, he arrived in Kansas in 1857, but he got married in Westville, Indiana in 1865. And if you check LaPorte County, Indiana marriages, sure enough, it's there. I don't know why they went back to Indiana, but I know they went back to Indiana to get married. This talks about his service records. Here, he served in the Mexican and Civil War, and it tells me his life story. It tells me that he was left an orphan at an early age and spent some short time with his grandmother. Having that information, there's no record that would have given me this. I found it in a local newspaper. Let's talk about collateral research. We've talked about cluster research. Collateral research is tracing all the others within the family, the siblings, the in-laws, the cousins, nieces and nephews, aunts and uncles. I have a Moore, and Moore is an impossible name. His name is John David Moore, but all I knew him as was John Moore. And John Moore lived in Douglas County and Jefferson County and Leavenworth County, Kansas. He kind of bounced around between the three. I could never get him further than that point. But he had two children. One was my ancestor, and I never really researched the other one. But when I started researching the other one, I found her death certificate in California. And on her death certificate, she specifically stated that his name was John David Moore. And all I had known was John up to that point. Sure enough, I found David Moore in the 1850 census, living in Missouri in Buchanan County, and I found him living in Ohio prior to that as John David or as David, depending on the record that we were able to find. So you need to trace those collateral lines, find out what else is going on. Here's a great example here. We go back to William McGinley in Kosciuszko County, Indiana. And on the History Geo page, there's somebody named Lance and Ransom. Now, as William McGinley moved west to Kansas, we leave census records, and I just want to pull this up so you can see. My ancestor was Clementine McGinley, his direct, and here we have a collateral, Delos McGinley. I did some research into Delos McGinley, and he ended up in Topeka, Kansas. So here we are researching in 1884, and I found a newspaper article in Topeka, Kansas, in which he is discovered, Delos McGinley is discovered by a Miss Dr. Margaret Ransom. She sees this young man working at the state capitol building in the newspaper, and she contacts him because her maiden name is McGinley, and she wonders if they're related. And she discovers after 40 years, she hadn't seen her brother that entire time frame, that she is N.D. McGinley's aunt. Ridiculous, because they were right there the whole time. She was right there the whole time. For me to have found her, I didn't need to do that collateral line to find her, but by doing it, I was able to find her. And I find the whole rest of the family thanks to that information. Here we see her in 1870 in Huntington County, Indiana, and living with her in her household is James McGinley, a tailor from Pennsylvania. He's roughly the same age. That's a collateral line. And if I research him and take him further, I find him in a disabled veterans home in Dayton, Ohio. There it is, profession tailor, clearly it's him. And he names his nearest relative as Amos McGinley of Warsaw, Kosciuszko County. And if I look at there in 1850, here's Amos McGinley and their father, John, who I didn't have until I found her in Kansas. Let's talk about identifying migration patterns. Now, we've already looked at these people. We've looked at the Lutheranism in Perry County, Ohio. We've seen those all the names and how they appear in these articles. This particular article talks about where they came from. And you'll find that over and over in these county histories, in articles that are written. They will tell you where they came from. Here it says that they came first to Pennsylvania, and then they went to the Shenandoah Valley in Maryland, and they ended up in the Piedmont belt of Virginia and the Carolinas. The Piedmont belt of Virginia and the Carolinas. What that tells me is, more than likely, to get from here to the Piedmont and Shenandoah Valley, I can look at migration records or information and figure that out. Now, a great resource for this is William Dollarhide's Map Guide to American Migration Routes. It's in your further study list. It talks about all the major migration patterns. It's not going to hit every trail that's out there, but it's going to hit the major ones. This one's pretty easy. It was pretty simple to figure out. Here's where they were at. That's where they went. It's Zane's Trace, Gist's Trace, and Braddock's Road. And they're headed down the Great Valley Road into Virginia, maybe Maryland. We'll see where we can find them. The first stop in Virginia is Loudoun County. There's a German settlement there. There's two German churches, the New Jerusalem Church and the German Reformed Church. If we check early church records in Loudoun County, Virginia, I find all these baptisms, including my direct ancestor, Heinrich Crumrine, son of Christian and Catherine Crumrine. It's that simple. If you're looking in a particular area and you're trying to figure out where people came from, read the county history. Look for articles on the county's history and see what they talk about the migration pattern. And then look for the trails that fed those patterns. Sometimes they'll say, oh, everybody came here on Braddock's Road, or everybody came here on the Seneca Road, or the Danville Peoria path, or, Follow those. Buffalo Trace, the Vincennes-Kaskaskia Trail. Follow those back and you will find the people along those routes. Finally, where there is a will, there is a way. Great pun. Probate records are great. Most people think when you talk about probate, oh, will, but there's a lot of information that's out there, and don't just think probate records, think everything that's out there, because there's so much out there that you can extract evidence from. Court records, church records, tax records, land deeds. I am always looking at different things, trying to figure out how I can piece together a story, because that's what we're doing most of the time. We're not going to have direct evidence of things. We're rarely going to have indirect evidence of things, but sometimes we're going to be able to find negative evidence that we can piece together a story from till we can find indirect evidence to make things work. Let's talk about an example. Here is the will of Christian Crumrine in 1821 in Perry County, Ohio. It's a great will. I use it in my will talk. I use it a lot. It's just a great example. In the will, he doesn't name his wife first. He names 6 children first. Catherine Crumrine, Philip, Michael, Elizabeth IV, late Elizabeth Crumrine, Mary Wilson, and Peter Crumrine. And note that he gives them all money. That's evidence. That means they're all adults. They all could receive money from his estate, so he gave them all money. These are all grown adults. They're probably all married. They may not even live in Perry County. Likely they don't, because wouldn't he have given them some land if they lived locally? He then names his wife, and then he names all the children by her begotten: Melena, Henry, Susanna, Margaret, Martin, John, Jacob, and Eliza. He then specifies that Catherine is to hold possession of his farm for 10 years from this year, then to be sold to all the legacies mentioned above, to be divided between her and those children by her begotten. Now, if I was to think on that hard, it's not there, right? It doesn't say this. But it should be suspicious to me that none of these children of Catherine received anything from the estate at this point in their lives. More than likely, Melena is no older than 20, because by 21, she could get married and probably receive something from this estate. It also tells me that Eliza, the youngest, is probably 11 years old, because in 10 years, the estate's going to be divided up and spread out. So that means she could be 21 and in receivership. That gives me a date range for those 8 children and their births. One is 20 and one is 11. And everybody else in between sits in between them. Let's talk about wills. Wills are a great resource for genealogy, but we have to keep in mind the limitations that are out there. We're going to be publishing an article this month in our Passports newsletter. It didn't even make it into the slideshow yet, where we talk about print transcriptions, indexes, and abstracts. Here we have an example of an index. When you're doing research out there in search and family search for wills, search and family search for probate records, the indexing is usually pretty limited. In the case of wills, it's going to be limited to the testator, the person who's deceased. In the case of deed records, it's going to just be the grantor or grantee. You have to keep in mind the limitations of the record keeping and who's doing the indexing. Print transcripts, abstracts, and indexes are fantastic because the people usually do every name indexing. So here we have an example. Loudoun County, Virginia, a will. I'm searching in an index to wills, not the actual will records. I find Crumrine's in there. But this isn't for a Crumrine will. This is actually the will of Anthony Souter. And Anthony Souter names his grandchildren in his will because his daughter is deceased. So she's not receiving anything, but his grandchildren are. And instead of saying Catherine's children, he says their names. Sure enough, if we look at the actual will, there they are. Grandchildren, Catherine Crumrine, Philip, and Michael Crumrine. Now, this is an important record for me because it establishes who Anthony Souter's grandchildren are from the rest of the children that we saw on Christian Crumrine's will. Remember, there were 6 and then there were 8? Well, the first 3 of those 6 are Souter grandchildren. The next 3, I don't know. They're not mentioned in this will, so they cannot be his grandchildren. And that's important for me because a lot of people out there who have done family trees have taken those 6 children and all put them in their family trees as being the grandchildren of Anthony Souter, but he only names 3, and the other 3 were born before that, based off of the will and them receiving money. And so there's a lot of confusion out there about this this family because of this. Let's look at some church records. We already saw Loudoun County, Virginia. I showed you the baptisms, but in this, there's also burial records going back to these Crumrines. There's a burial record for a Maria Elizabeth Crumrine, wife of Christian Crumrine, November of 1792. And there's a burial record for Margaretha, wife of Christian Crumrine. He got married really quickly there, September 1793. We know from Anthony Souter's will that his 3 grandchildren were Catherine, Philip, and Michael. And here we have wife 2, Maria Elizabeth, her possible children, Elizabeth, Mary, or Anna Maria, and Peter. And we've got wife 3. She was they were married too short a time period. They might have had 1 child, probably didn't. And then we have wife number 4, Maria Catherine, 8 children. We could take those and assemble all that. But a word of caution with print transcripts and indexes. They are great. They are the go-to for me when I'm doing pre-1850s research. But there are mistakes. Transcribers, abstractors, they're human. They're going to make mistakes. And so be aware of that as you're doing your research. Here's an abstract from York County, Pennsylvania for McGinley's. And you can see it names John McGinley, Jane, his wife, and their children. It's pretty cool because this one names the spouses of the married daughters. But if we look at the actual will that it's transcribing, the transcriber missed Sarah Rankin, missed her husband, James Rankin, and missed her brother, James McGinley. So be aware that sometimes you're going to miss, so you need to look at the surnames and check everything. As you're finding the surnames in these books, do not just go, oh, my guy isn't listed. You need to go in and dig deeper, look at the actual records and double check the transcribers, make sure they didn't miss something. When I find a surname in a particular county that I'm researching, I research every individual with that surname in the county, even if the surname is Smith, because I don't want to miss something like this. Other records that are out there, probate records. Probate records are fantastic. People do not spend enough time looking at probate records. They just look at the will and they move on. But there's so much that is out there in the probate records that you're just not going to know until you start digging. Here's a probate inventory. You've probably heard of inventories before, but maybe you didn't think of them for what they could be useful for. Here's a probate inventory from 1769 in Frederick County, Maryland for James McGinley. And this is the only record other than the headstone where his spouse, Margaret McGinley, appears by name. The only other record other than the headstone. And so this is the only way I can link this couple up to this headstone. But I know from this record for his probate that that's their headstone. Here she is, and all it says is she was 70 years of age in 1770. That's all the headstone says. So by having this probate record and just having that name from there, that confirms that I've got the right family. I'm looking in the right cemetery for them. Another type of probate record that people overlook is orphans court records or guardianship records. Orphans court being the court in Pennsylvania and Maryland for this. for guardianships. Orphans court records sometimes say a lot of good information. In this case, Amos McGinley died intestate. That means he had no will, and he died in 1792. The Orphans Court would have assigned administrators in this particular case. The Orphans Court names his minor children because there's a guardianship that's hanging out there. We get their names and ages. That's fantastic. But the Orphans Court names his late widow, and he names her by her maiden name. Who would have thought to go look for her as the administrator to his intestate estate? But there she is by her maiden name. I mentioned these earlier, deeds, deed acknowledgments. I talked about that when we talked about land. Here it says, Louisa, wife of the said John Weaver. If I didn't have this record, I would have never been able to connect Louisa to John Weaver, because this is 1775 and she doesn't have any records that don't exist. So I need to be paying attention to weird things like this. The deed acknowledgement or the dower release. Elizabeth Pouncey, wife of James A. Pouncey. This is the only place where I find her name at this time and place. You're going to find other things in deed records. Here we have an example. In early Pennsylvania, early Maryland, Virginia, they lived under a feudal system of land. And so most individuals didn't apply for deed records. It would be their children or their grandchildren who would have applied for their deeds. My James McGinley came to Adams County, Pennsylvania in 1745. He purchased over 1,000 acres from Charles Carroll, who represented Daniel Carroll as his brother. And Daniel Carroll had died at that time point. Well, in 1762 to 1767, a couple of gentlemen from England had come over and they did a survey. You've probably heard of it, Mason and Dixon line. And it turned out that James McGinley's property was north of the line, and that Pennsylvania had come calling and they needed proof of their land ownership. And so he died, and his son went down to Charles Carroll and said, I need a deed. And so Charles Carroll, being a shrewd businessman, required him to pay an alienation fine, a sum of money, so that he could be released from his tenancy under his feudal lord and actually own the property and receive a deed, which was issued in Frederick County, Maryland. So we have a piece of property in which there's a land right that was issued long, long ago to Daniel Carroll. And we have Charles Carroll selling this land without any record to James McGinley. And we have his son, Amos McGinley, after his death, coming to Charles Carroll and saying, I need some proof that I own this property. And Charles Carroll saying, well, you got to pay me a fee so that I can issue you a deed to this property, which isn't, the deed isn't even issued in the county or the, what would be the state where he settled. Be aware of the things that are going on in the place that you're researching. You can't just focus in on the records of that place. Continuing with this line, Amos gets this deed, but he had a brother. My ancestor, his brother John McGinley, didn't get a deed to that property ever. He died in 1796, and he issued the land to two of his children, Ebenezer and Joseph. But they didn't get deeds to the property until 1805, when Anne McFerrin, the spouse of Amos McGinley, distributed the property from her estate. There were multiple things going on here, and the land couldn't be released until her children were of age so that she could distribute the estate to them and issue deeds to her nephews. That's complicated. But that's just what we can entertain from this information. So to recap from today's talk, just some of the basic things that we covered, reasonably exhaustive research, digging in, looking at the evidence that is presented to us and following that process that we talked about and that's covered in your handout. evidence-based research. Focus in not on the records themselves, but the evidence that you can find from them, what you can extract from them, the stories that we can tell. You know, looking at those deed records, what I could work out through those deed records, the negative evidence that was there. We know that he never got a deed for the land. We get a son getting the deed for the land because of the Mason-Dixon survey. We get him dying, his spouse taking over as the administrator of the estate, and her not being able to distribute the land to his nephews until her children are of age. Cluster research, looking at everybody in the community, not just that small knit family that you want to look at. Look at everybody. Do a community analysis. Look at all the names that appear in the early settlers list and where they came from, and see if any of those are clues to where your people came from. Following the minister, the most written about person in a community. Connecting with local history, you know, looking in the history books, finding all those things, the early settlers, the congregants of the church, the minister, who the store owners are, the blacksmith, whoever it might be that you could use to trace. Collateral research, searching everybody, the siblings, the children. Take them out, not just yours. Take everybody out and see if you can make connections from them. Maybe somewhere in those records, they tell you the story. Identifying the migration patterns. Following the people, going to Dollarhide's book and looking at the trails that went to the area that you're at. Look for canals, look for rivers that people might have migrated up, and use those to find different counties to look in. And then finally, look at everything that you can look at and think about what could be extracted from it. You know, don't just look at a will. You need to look at the whole probate case file. Don't just look at one land deed. Look at all the deeds in an area to see what you can extract, or look at all the military bounty warrants and land patents in an area and see what you can extract from it. Don't just focus in on, I need the passenger list, because you're not going to get anywhere if you start focusing in that way. I got to have that land deed. Well, maybe you don't need that deed. Maybe you need somebody else's deed, or maybe you just need to check the indexing, the print indexing, and see if the name appears in the index and look for other people's records. Don't get focused on one thing. Be open to the idea that there might be information hidden in different places that you haven't thought of. Well, thank you. I think we're ready for questions.
Yep.
I see a few.
Yep, we do. And I'm going to go ahead and open those up now and we'll see what we have. I know that there is one in there. Let me start with this one because I can answer this one. Is there a handout? And yes, we have a handout that is located in several different places. You may have received a reminder email. Should have a link to the handout in there. If not, I did put a link to the handout in the chat. And then also, if you can't get it one of those two ways, if you go onto our website, slcl.org/genealogy, and if you go to our virtual classroom, there is in the very first paragraph, it mentions handouts. And if you click there, you'll see all of the handouts, and this class is there as well. Okay, we have a few other questions, and also if you haven't typed a question yet and you do want to ask a question, go ahead and do that now. We'll go ahead and get to these other ones though. First of all, we have on land records, when it says of Clark County, Ohio, for example, does it mean they are still there even though they are buying land in Indiana? Or does it mean that's where they were before they came to Indiana and got the land?
Keep your options open, right? We always have to keep our options open. Think about that as a clue and use that clue going forward. It's not an absolute. In that particular case, he had land from a bounty warrant in 1848, but I find him in the 1850 census in Clark County, Ohio. He was living with an individual, and the reason he's there is he's actually going to college. So keep your options open. He's got land in 1848, but it was through a bounty warrant, and he had just served in the military, so he didn't necessarily want to go farming. He went and got an education instead. Then he bought more land. the clue there for me in that particular case going forward from there was that when I look at the maps on History Geo, the railroad went right through the middle of the property. He sold that property within a year and ended up in Iowa, in Black Hawk County, Iowa. So he moved pretty quickly because I don't think he wanted to be a farmer. He ended up being a dentist and a photographer and surveyor. He had quite the life. It was something for sure. But he kept buying land and he kept like leasing it out and having other farmers come in and work his property so he could make an income off that property and do what he actually wanted to do. But yeah, it's a great clue and you should always pay attention to it. They might be there at that time. They might be purchasing from there. That may be where they're moving from. We don't know what the person who recorded the document, what they asked them, just like we don't know in the census. If somebody says that they're from Iowa when they're in Kansas, that doesn't necessarily mean they were born in Iowa. And in his case, he says that he was, on the census, he says that he was from Iowa, Indiana, and Ohio, and Pennsylvania. And he was born in Ohio. He owned property, at least in Indiana. I know he owned property in Iowa at one point, but I know he was born in Ohio. So just keep that in mind. We don't know what they asked, and he isn't the one writing it down. It's somebody else recording it.
Okay. All right, Jake. So you mentioned posting that you posted concerning that plat map on LinkedIn. Do people do genealogy on that site?
Oftentimes what I'm doing is just sharing, something that, one of our programs that's up and coming, that's from several years ago. I had posted a program that was up and I don't think so, really. I mean, there's a lot of good info out there, and if you connect with with professional genealogists, you can get a lot of good information. I don't necessarily subscribe to blogs anymore or do any of that. I just go on LinkedIn and I connect with the individuals who I know are providing that information. I just get it all in one place. So that's what I use it for. Is I connect with the professionals who are out there that do this, and they're providing me with the same content I would have gotten from going to 10 different blogs before.
Okay, and where is the best place to research a particular clergyman if you only have his name and where the marriage took place?
Local histories are fantastic. Percy, go to the periodical source index. It's on Find My Past and search that county and that denomination and see if there are any articles that have been written. You just don't know. Here in St. Louis, we've got wonderful histories that have been written on most of the denominations, and that's true throughout the country. That's one of the most common topics we find in local history is people want to talk about, their local denominations, their local churches. They record, everything that you could possibly think of about them, except maybe all the names of everybody who attended. So that's where I would look. Check your county history first. They always have sections. Either there'll be a section on religion, or there will be in the individual townships or communities, there will be sections on the churches. That's where I start. And then I go to Percy, look for that. I look to see if there are denominational histories. A lot of times we saw that Presbytery of Carlisle, that's a 2-volume set in Pennsylvania where they talk about all the different ministers in that area. There are also encyclopedias for denomination. I didn't show that example, but if we looked in the Encyclopedia of Lutheranism, the Hinkles are mentioned. So Andrew Hinkle is in the encyclopedia. He's just a random minister out in Ohio, but there he is in the encyclopedia, and his entire family were ministers, and so each one of them's listed. So it just depends on what denomination you're working with, where you would go, but there's going to be resources out there for you to do that.
Okay, and we had someone who thanked us and they really enjoyed the program. And then some more about the chat and finding the handout. So I'm going to go ahead and temporarily enable this. So I'm hoping that that means that you can see that link in the chat. Like I said, though, if not, we do have it up on the website. You're going to go to slcl.org. You're going to go to genealogy. You're going to go to virtual classroom and then click on the handouts. And then also go back and check your email because there may have been a link in your reminder email from today to that handout as well. Okay, and we have one more that I can see up here. So if you do have any questions, go ahead and type them now. Any more questions? Our last one appears to be, I have ancestors 1700 to 1800 in Adams County, Pennsylvania and Fredericks County, Maryland. Do you have any other resources you might recommend?
It is fun to research there. It's my favorite place to do research because it's so complicated. With boundary changes, you're going to have issues no matter what you do. There's just no way around it. In our passports newsletter, I covered early land records in I want to say July and September of this year. So go on our website and find our publications, passports newsletter. You're going to find land record information there. There's a great book. It's sitting on my desk right now. It's called Pennsylvania Land Records by Donna Munger. She covers land records in the area. If you're researching in Adams County and Fredericks County, Maryland at that time frame, you're going to be probably looking for licenses if you can get them early on. And then you're going to be looking for deeds after, say, 1770, 1769, after the Mason-Dixon line. On top of that, probate records can be in Adams, they could be in York, they could be in Lancaster, because Adams is formed from York, which is formed from Lancaster. But the people who settled Adams mostly settled Adams out of Maryland. And so a lot of times they filed their records in Frederick, but Frederick was formed out of Baltimore County. And a lot of the people who issued those properties didn't live in Baltimore County, but in Arundel. So you're going to have to look in 6 or even 7 different counties for records. Better call me if you have questions on that one. We can walk you through all the different places you can look. That's a very complicated challenge researching, particularly in Adams, because of all the different places the records are and the people never moved.
Very good. I think that's all we have. So again, if anybody has any last minute questions, if you want to get those in there. Again, just to reiterate on the handout, because there is a very good handout that goes along with this presentation, our website, virtual classroom, a genealogy virtual classroom, and handouts.
Being recorded, so the handout it'll be on the website once the recording goes up. It's only a few days usually for us to get those recordings up.
Yes, and we had another comment, great class, thanks. So great. Well, thank you all for attending as well. We hope you enjoyed the class and found the information to be useful. If you have any further questions or comments, please feel free to contact History and Genealogy at 314-994-3300 or by email at genealogy@slcl.org. If you are watching this live, I remind you that this class has been recorded and will be made available on the library's website at www.slcl.org/genealogy and the library's YouTube channel. If you are watching this recorded on YouTube, we invite you to like this video and post a comment below. This ends the webinar. Have a good evening.